For today's lesson, we're going to take a look at the drug nicotine. Nicotine, as many of you know, is found in tobacco products, and certainly smoking gets a pretty bad rap. And so one of the questions that is posed by the textbook is smoking just a bad habit, or should it be classified as a serious addiction, like cocaine addiction or alcohol addiction? When we look at people who are addicted to tobacco products, what we see is that these people continue to use these products even when to do so causes serious health problems, or even after they have been diagnosed with serious health problems. Now, one thing to remember when we're talking about tobacco products, there's more than just nicotine in those products. There are, in some cases, thousands of other substances and molecules that can cause problems. What we're going to focus on is going to be the role of nicotine. Some of the statistics that your textbook highlights is that 40% of people smoke after having a laryngectomy, usually for throat cancer. 50% of heart attack survivors continue to smoke after having heart attacks, and 50% of people treated for lung cancer continue to smoke. And that's from Carlson, 2015. So what we're seeing is that despite having some very serious side effects, people continue to smoke, continue to be compelled to smoke, and report very strong cravings for nicotine. As I mentioned, we're going to focus on the research on nicotine in particular, as opposed to tobacco in general. What we do find is that, like humans, animals will self-administer nicotine. What we see in terms of the neurobiology of nicotine is that nicotine stimulates nicotinic acetylcholinergic receptors. In addition, nicotine increases dopaminergic activity in the mesolimbic system as well as the nucleus accumbens. This probably makes sense given that nicotine has a very strong reinforcing component, and certainly people do report a strong addiction, so the fact that it is triggering some activity in the dopaminergic system as well as the nucleus accumbens does make sense. Specific research on the reinforcing effects of nicotine is that it works via the activation of nicotinic receptors in the ventral tegmental area. And this is actually quite interesting because they also looked at stimulating the nucleus accumbens directly and found that that was not as strong. And so it's actually this particular pathway that turns out to be very important. Further research looked at endogenous cannabinoids and found that they also play a role in the reinforcing effects of nicotine. Research has found that drugs that block those cannabinoid receptors decrease nicotine self-administration by reducing dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. So what we're seeing is that the pathways through which nicotine acts are actually quite complex. Next, we'll take a look at what is happening inside the brain of someone who has smoked for a long period of time. What we can try to better understand is what's happening to the neurons and to the receptors over time when a person smokes or ingests nicotine on a regular basis. When someone smokes, the amount of nicotine in the brain rises and remains steady because nicotine is not destroyed by acetylcholinesterase, or ACHE. And this is what's important. If you just had acetylcholine, then the acetylcholinesterase would break that down. But nicotine is working to agonize, or it sort of looks enough like acetylcholine, and it's going to remain active on the receptor and in the cleft. Nicotine receptors are turned on or activated, but then become desensitized. So when you have these receptors getting excited, they don't stay excited. They actually kind of get desensitized. And another thing that can actually occur is that there's often an increase in the number of nicotinic receptors. So what we see is that when there's a whole bunch of extra nicotine, just as if there was a whole bunch of extra acetylcholine, then you develop or grow extra receptors to respond to them. And on the flip side, when you decide to quit smoking, you take away all that nicotine, but then you leave behind all these extra receptors, and it takes time for those receptors to become reabsorbed or die off. And that may be in part what leads to some of the withdrawal effects that we see when folks try to quit smoking. When people try to quit smoking, they have some very standard withdrawal symptoms. They report anxiety, insomnia, the inability to concentrate. They may struggle with memory. They may report restlessness or fidgeting, and certainly will report cravings for the nicotine itself. And these are the general symptoms that we see. As I mentioned before, we see that when you take away that drug from the brain, the receptors and the neurons don't change immediately. And so when you are quitting, it often takes a very long time for the brain to change and adapt to the new level of nicotine, or absence of nicotine, as the case may be. As we saw, nicotine affected a number of different pathways, a number of different neurotransmitters, and as we will see, it affects several brain areas. And this may be part of the reason why nicotine is so addictive and is such a challenging addiction to try and break. A couple of other brain areas that we see affected: one is the insula. Research on this area has found that damage to this area can actually make quitting smoking easier. We've seen this in patients who have stroke damage, and certainly we can damage this part of the brain in animals that are self-administering nicotine. Infusion of inhibitory drugs into the insula reduce the reinforcing effects of nicotine, and research has found that the insula is larger in smokers compared to non-smokers. We also have seen a decrease in the amount of frontal cortex gray matter in smokers. And so if we're decreasing part of the frontal cortex that's going to inhibit certain responses, perhaps this also explains why it may be challenging to quit smoking. So hopefully you've learned a little bit about what nicotine does to various parts of the brain, to various neurotransmitters, and to the neurons and receptors itself to exert its effects in the brain.